Okay, everyone, good morning. What I figured I'd do this semester, since at least the preparation course is supposed to be an online course, is to add to the films and the videos and the resources already on Blackboard and give you some gradual input as we go along. On various topics that could be of interest to you as you are in the project or considering where you probably are in the project. Of course, none of that substitutes the individual meetings we're having, but I'm hoping it can um, keep you excited, give you some more tips along the way, some things that I just happen to know about the process that you're going through. And today's presentation is going to be about that preliminary literature review that you're doing, giving you some tips on what exactly are you looking for, what exactly are you trying to do, and then at the end of this brief presentation, I'm going to share also some thoughts on how to look for instruments for either the study or the work project that you're conducting. So here we go. So the title of today's presentation is Moving Forward. And like all other presentations, it's going to be pretty informal. But here is the main message that I wanted to send to you. These are the three topics I'm going to be covering. First, what should you do with your preliminary literature review? Second, differences between studies and projects as it pertains to the literature review. So how far should you go, and what are you actually looking for when you do your preliminary literature review for a study or a work project? And then how do you find research and project instruments, which frankly may be something that interests work project people or not. It really depends on the work project you're doing. Some people's work projects will involve needs analysis or evaluation processes or interviews with people, at which point instruments actually matter to you. And when I say instrument, I don't mean only a survey. It could be an interview questionnaires, for example. So hold on. Now, if your project has absolutely nothing to do with figuring things out or interviewing people or surveying people, then that portion of the presentation probably doesn't pertain to you. Just, stop the video at that point. The main questions that you're trying to find out here are, first, why does your project or study matter? This is really what you're trying to find out from your literature review. And the second one is, how do you find answers to your research or project questions? So here we go, and we're going to start with the preliminary literature review. And this is not exactly about how to find articles on the Drake library. That I already did in the last video that I sent you. Okay, so the key advice as you're doing your preliminary review is scan. Yes, I know that at some point in time, one of the things that I recommended that you do is that you start doing a brief summary of the articles that you're going to be using, not so much official summary, but basically what I call a data dump, in which you literally transfer to a separate Word document the pieces of the puzzle, the pieces of the article that you think will be most useful to you as you actually write your paper. But even before that comes the scan, and the scan is to determine, is this an article that is worth even looking at? Is this something that I'm going to put in my PBWorks wiki and then later pay attention to and later create an informal summary? Or is this something that doesn't really matter? And at that point, you need to learn to very quickly go through the abstract, at most go through the first few paragraphs, take a look at the conclusion, and figure out if that's an article that is worth looking at or not. Frankly, I make my decisions based on the summary alone, the abstract alone. Okay. Once you find, for example, books that you think would be helpful, here's the main advantage of books, is that they give you a thought, they help you narrow down your topic or transform your topic, go from a topic to an actual bona fide research question or project objective. That's what a book can do. So I'm not saying read the entire book, order 5 books and read them all. Otherwise, We're going to be talking about this next year. The point is, take a look at what those books have to offer. And frankly, oftentimes, you don't even have to read the book, because you can go on Amazon, you can go in our e-learning book, our ebook collection, for example, but you can go on Amazon and you can look inside, you can see what the table of contents are. And sometimes even looking at what those contents are gives you some ideas on what your project could be or how to narrow down your topic. So that's how books can help you. Books can also give you a nice introduction to the topic so that you can start seeing, okay, these are likely to be the main theorists. This is what's hot. This is what people are really talking about, especially if you select recent books. So usually when I run a literature review, I program the system so that it only gives me the materials from, say, the last, for example, 10 years. Right. The helpfulness of a book is particularly true for academic books. And academic books, what I mean by an academic book, is not only a textbook that you would use in a class, even though those are particularly helpful, but also those academic books that have a bunch of summaries. So what they actually are is a compilation of journals. Those are great because even if you read the introduction of the book, especially again, if it's a recent book, it gives you an idea of what's the most recent, what's the most important research in the area. Don't read the whole thing, just read the introduction, take a look at what each of those articles are about, and then just hold on to that for a later review. Remember, what you're doing at this point is solidifying what your research question or questions really are, not learning everything there is to learn about that research question. That's step number 2. Articles. What's the purpose of the article, of reading the article? Not the entire article, not the long literature review that every article is going to include. What you're really trying to find out is what research has been conducted. And usually you can find that out by the abstract alone, because good abstracts are going to tell you, this is what my study was all about. These are the people that I surveyed. These are the results that I found out. That's all you need. And if you create a brief set of notes of these are the research studies that have already been conducted, that gives you a sense already of what the gap is. The other good place for you to look in the article is in the topics for future research. So if you go at the very end, there's an area about topics for future research, which gives you great ideas on where to go next. Now, the fact that something has not been done before, and to clarify at this point, I'm talking mostly to study people, to the people who are doing research studies. If you're actually doing a project, hold on, I'm going to talk to you just in a minute. It's going to be one of the next coming slides. But for you who are doing a research study, the fact that something has been done before does not mean you can't do it again, especially if the dream of your life is not to get this published. Frankly, from the standpoint of the capstone, I'm not that worried on whether your study has been done before or not. Replicating an existing study is a perfectly legitimate study. But what you want to know is, why would replication make sense? So if your topic has been researched before, then what population and sample were used? Chances are was not done in central Iowa, or it was not done with graduate students, or it was not done with the population you have access to, which may be specifically the population that works with, I don't know, insurance, or maybe they haven't looked at managers, or maybe they haven't looked at non-managers. So the key sometimes in replication is to you to say, ooh, this is what was found with a group of psychology students in the Himalaya. So now I'm going to try to find out whether what they found actually holds water to graduate students in Des Moines, which is perfectly okay. So the location, the geography matter. Also, sometimes these are very small studies, and you can't really draw meaningful conclusions about pretty much anything by looking at what 100 people said in France. So where was it run and how large it was is important. Now, if you've discovered this topic that has been studied ad nauseamly everywhere under the sun with very large studies, and by golly, we already know the Earth is round, then it doesn't make sense for you to run the 20,000th study to find out whether the world is round. Okay, now, So the question that you're answering here is your question obvious or interesting? If you're asking a question about whether the earth is round, that's kind of silly. If you're running an entire study to find out that, I don't know, um, boring professors make people bored, that's probably not a very interesting question. So if you're replicating an interesting study or an interesting question, an important question, you have a better case than if you're replicating for the 10th time with a very similar population, something everything knows. Now, everybody knows. Now, again, of course, this is common sense, guys, but that's what you're trying to find out with your preliminary literature study, literature review. What I'm doing, does it matter? Or is it just for me to get a grade? Now, why does it matter if it matters? Like, why am I worried about the fact that your study should have a justification? That goes back to the idea of protection of human subjects, which is particularly relevant for people doing pure research or people doing research that is not applicable to a particular organization, but it's also relevant to people who are doing organizational projects. Basically, here's the deal. You do not waste people's time. You do not involve people in a study that doesn't matter. So why do we need to know if the study matters? Because we don't want to waste people's time. There is a more complicated ethical reason for that. And those of you who are doing pure studies are probably going to be completing the IRB training, and then the IRB training is going to go quite at length about that. But it suffices to say now that the reason that we care that your study matters is that we don't want, in Drake's name and with Drake's, endorsement, to be wasting people's time. Okay? Right. Now, let's talk about the differences between studies and projects, not in general, because you all know that by now, but as far as your literature review, does it matter whether you're looking for information on a study or information on a project? So, if you are doing a study, originality, or at least the ability to justify your the replication are important pieces of the puzzle. So if you're doing a pure study, then you're looking either for something that hasn't been done before, or an angle that hasn't been used before, or a replication that matters. If, however, you're doing a project, then what you're trying to justify is a little different. The thing that matters the most is the relevance to your organization. Guess what? You're not going to get information on whether that matters to your organization by doing a big literature search on EBSCO or on Google Scholar. You need to investigate that in your organization itself. Sometimes that means having a conversation with your manager and documenting that conversation. Sometimes that means talking to colleagues. Sometimes that means looking at organizational documents. The first thing I said, which is to talk to your manager, is probably the most commonly used one. So in your case, originality, the fact that that hasn't been done before, may matter less than accessibility and applicability. Let me explain. Accessibility means the information is accessible to you, or the instrument you're using is accessible to you. So let's say that you want to create a new employee engagement assessment, and there are various other engagement assessments in there. So why would you create a new one? One of the possible explanations is, yes, there are several out there, but they are proprietary, they're not available to us, and in terms of applicability, they don't really ask the questions that we need to ask as an organization. Now, beware the trap of thinking that your organization is so unique that only something created only for your organization is going to work. In fact, in my experience, that is greatly overblown. Like every organization out there thinks that it's so unique that everything that is done has to apply uniquely to it. But with that said, it's legitimate for you to, for example, say, yes, there are thousands of leadership competency models out there, but the competency models in existence either are proprietary or would not really answer the question, what leadership competencies are relevant for people to become successful in my organization considering my culture. These are discussions that you and I can have privately, but you get the idea. Your project has to be applicable. The materials have to either be necessary or not either not exist or not be accessible to you. A question that you're going to be asking yourself is the project itself, whatever your project is it relevant to the organization? Now, why am I saying the organization and not my organization? Because it's not at all a requirement that a workplace project be conducted at your work. There are lots of organizations out there that are in need of consulting work or leadership consulting work or other sorts of assessments, including student organizations at Drake, student groups, all sorts of executive leadership situations taking place in not-for-profits, at your place of worship, at the not-for-profit that you support. So there are groups out there clamoring for help in a variety of areas, and those groups would be just the ones for you to go in and try to do something with them. The second bullet I already talked about. So if, for example, you're running a training program on, I don't know, leadership development, and I can assure you there are thousands of those, and many of those are in published books that you can purchase for, I don't know, $50. So does it make sense for you to create one for your own? That's not a question that I can answer, but that's a question that you have to answer. Okay. And finally, we get to the third thing that I said I would address in this brief presentation, and that how do you find research and project instruments? By instrument, I mean anything that you're going to use to figure things out. It could be a questionnaire, it could be an interview protocol, really, yes, and it could be a quantitative questionnaire or a qualitative questionnaire. It's basically anything that you're going to use to gather information. It's possible that your workplace project has nothing to do with gathering information, and that's unlikely, but it's possible. And if that's your case, feel free not to listen to this information anymore. Goodbye to you. For everybody else, stay on. It's not going to take too much longer. Okay. Let's see. I think I already said that. Instruments may be required for projects or studies if the project requires any kind of study. Needs analysis, evaluations, climate studies, and engagement studies. Is my place a good place of work study? But definitely people who are doing pure studies are going to need some kind of instrument. Here is the rule of thumb. Thou shalt not reinvent the wheel, especially when it comes to instruments, because trust me here, creating a research instrument is a project by itself. You pretty much don't need anything, and it's probably too hard of a project for you to choose as a capstone. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say that I wanted to invent an assessment to measure, I'm just going to say engagement because it's something that I do, so it's at the back of my mind. First, I would have to do a thorough literature review to understand what assessments are out there and how is engagement defined and how are constructs that are associated with engagement defined. I'd have to run a literature review on each of the constructs that I'm trying to connect to engagement. Then I would have to create my questions based on all that. Then I would have to send my questions to a panel of experts who would then determine whether my questions are holding water as far as the constructs that I'm trying to measure. After that, I would need to pilot all of that with a sufficiently representative group, and then I would have to statistically analyze everything that I did to find out if my questions are holding water. And then probably I would have to test it again and continue collecting data. I don't think you want to do all that. Okay, so assuming that you don't want to do all that, let's move on to the best alternatives. So the first question is, does the instrument exist out there? If it does, is it accessible? Does it meet your needs? And if it doesn't meet your needs exactly, can it be adapted? So let's go through these a little bit more. Here's a common mistake when I asked, does the instrument exist and is it accessible and does it meet your needs? Sometimes people think that they have to find the perfect or the exact instrument. So for example, if I'm running a study on, I don't know if my next slide says that, No, I didn't. So I'm just going to say it. Imagine that I'm running a study on the burnout experienced by graduate college students who have young children younger than 10. So then people think that they have to look for an assessment out there that measures burnout for college students who have kids younger than 10. And chances are you're not going to find that. So you don't have to be that precise. And I think my slides coming up are going to go through that more. So I'm going to move on, and then if I need to give further explanations. So a few things that you can consider and that would be adaptable to your needs. For example, qualitative instruments, interview protocols, qualitative surveys. So if you're reading a study that reports on a qualitative review, and it includes usually in the appendix a series of questions, well, those questions could be transformed into a quantitative set of questions. You know where you find that is really good source is dissertations and theses, because dissertations and theses, unlike normal articles, have to publish the instruments that they used at the end, so it makes it easy for you to see. Likewise, quantitative instruments can be transformed or converted into qualitative interview questions. Existing models or theoretical papers can give you a framework that can become a question. So the problem is not so much creating your own question, even though ideally you shouldn't. The problem is when you're creating your question out of thin air. So if, for example, let's take the example of the MSLD competency model. The MSLD competency model was based on a considerable amount of work investigating the competencies that were likely to be important to leaders. And if anybody's interested, I can tell you exactly how that was done. Okay, so the competency model, if you look at the definitions, it has a series of sentences that defines that competency. Well, it's not impossible for you to use that definition as a source of questions. So if, I don't know, innovation and future thinking says something like creates an environment where people feel free to experiment, then you could have a question saying, does your manager create an environment that allows you to feel free to experiment? This is just a crazy idea that is coming to my mind, but what I'm trying to say is that if you find a model or an instrument or a conceptual paper that gives you a very clear set of guidelines or a very clear definition for certain constructs, sometimes you can create questions that operationalize or that really investigate those concepts. Sometimes also you can use instruments that are used to answer other questions or serve other populations, but that can be adapted to your needs. So for example, let's say that I'm looking for an instrument on the coping mechanisms of bullying victims in the workplace. It's possible that I can find an instrument on school place bullying, but I could maybe revise the question somewhat or revise the scenario somewhat so as to increase relevancy of that particular instrument to my particular study. Is this ideal? No, I would jump up and down if I found an instrument on the coping mechanisms of bullying victims in the workplace, even if the workplace is maybe a little different than mine. So maybe it's at a hospital and I can make very slight adaptations so that would work in the insurance industry. So the least you have to adapt, the better. But sometimes people get stuck with, I can't find an instrument because nothing exists exactly on the area that I'm in. And by the way, that applies also for literature reviews. I can't find articles. When I go talk to the people who say they can't find articles, it's because they're looking for articles exactly on their research study. And it's possible that their research study exactly like that has not been done before. So you need to be a little creative and look for topics that are related to your research study. So, ideally, pick exactly the instrument you need and said instrument has all the appropriate validity and reliability reports. If you don't know what validity and reliability mean, there are on Blackboard in the same area, there are specific little videos, I think even little animations explaining what validity and reliability means. So look for an instrument that has that. But if you can't find that, pick a sound and reputable instrument and adapt it to your needs. Now, whichever road you take, whether you're going to adapt it or whether you're not going to adapt it, you probably need permission. Now, if it's exactly the instrument you're using, you certainly need permission. Permission from the author, that is. If you're adapting it, it really depends on how much you're adapting. I would say you probably need permission. So in the case of adaptation, just talk to me and I'll help guide you through, do you need permission for this one or not? I like to say, when in doubt, ask for permission. When you look for an academic kind of instrument, it's very unlikely you won't get the permission. So how do you obtain permission? Is it an academic study? Was it published in either a chapter in an academic book, or it was published in, and not a textbook, but one of those academic books I talked about before that have various chapters, or was it published in an academic article? Just Google the name of the author. Chances are the author is a professor at some university somewhere. You go to that university, you discover that person's email address, you write to the person, you say, I'm a graduate student, I'm conducting my capstone, I would like to use your instrument, or I need to make slight adaptations in your instrument, and then you say, what? Would I be allowed to use it? I do not recall in 7 years at Drake anybody receiving a no. It's possibly it happened, but if it happened, it will have happened once or twice. What sometimes happens is people fail to answer. When they fail to answer, it's possible that they moved to another university, that they didn't receive the email, your email may have been blocked. One tip is write from your Drake email address, because an edu address is far less likely to be blocked than if you write from Gmail or something like that. If the instrument you're talking about was published in a proprietary, like in a company that sells assessments, it's probably not possible. So I would say look for an academic study, look for a survey that was published in an academic study, or look for a survey that was published in a government study, because usually stuff that happens at the government level is considered copyrights free. When in doubt about that, talk to me, because I can guide you through the process. But my main message is, don't assume that because it's published, you can actually use it. You do need permission to use somebody else's interview protocol, instrument, or whatnot, even when you're making an adaptation, unless the adaptation is so big that at the end of the day you can say, well, ideas are not copyrightable. This was changed enough that really you don't need permission. But those cases are rare, especially because it's not advisable for you to change that much. That's all I wanted to do for today. I hope this was not too long. I didn't count myself here. But I hope you're finding these useful, and also they get into our, series of videos that we have for this course. If there are specific topics that have not yet been recorded and that you would love me to write about, please send me a note and give me some ideas, and that could very well be my next video. Other than that, if you're having trouble, remember never to suffer in silence. Give me a call. Let's schedule a meeting. Sometimes even a phone conversation can do wonders to keep you on track. My main purpose this semester for the people actually doing the research project 291 is for you guys to complete it successfully. For you guys who are doing 290 is that by the end of the semester you will have your proposal beautifully ready. You will know exactly where you're headed. You will have your survey determined, and then once the semester in which you're actually taking 291 starts, you start, you hit the ground running, you know exactly where you're going. Best of luck to you, and have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.